Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Welcome again, everybody, to Question Mark, the podcast. And today I have the enormous privilege of introducing to you someone who actually works in the same kind of area of biblical storytelling, and that's Phil Ruge-Jones from the States. And without further ado, can I ask you, Phil, to tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Sure, it'd be a pleasure to. My name is Phil Ruge-Jones. As you said, I'm a pastor in a smallish congregation in northern Wisconsin. Before that, I was a professor for 18 years in a university, teaching in the area of theology. I've biblical storytelling, or the presenting of biblical texts by heart, is something that's been really important in my life and development. I've been doing it since I think the mid to late 90s. And then about 2007, I started telling the entire Gospel of Mark, like Stephen does, yes. In different places around the country. And so that's part of my claim to fame. And there are two ways that work still continues in a very active way. I coordinate a group of scholars and highly trained storytellers who get together every summer and explore what happens when we're in the same room performing biblical texts. And we don't just do Mark, we do, this year we're doing Romans, we did Ecclesiastes last year, so we do all kinds of biblical literature. And so I coordinate that group. This is my last year coordinating. I'm handing it over to somebody else after 17 years. But that's been very generative in my experience. And then I'm contracted to work with the American Bible Society. And I'm supposed to be there now, but I got a case of COVID, and so it didn't work out. I was supposed to be in Guatemala, where we teach 4 biblical stories from the Old Testament. They're fairly long ones, often a whole chapter, in Spanish to 3 teams of translators, who then in the afternoon translate it into oral storytelling in their mother tongues that don't have a written Old Testament. And then they learn it by heart, and they go home and tell it in their home context to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to that word.
What an amazing thing.
Those are some of the fun things I get to be involved in.
That's brilliant. And we've obviously come across each other through our shared interests. But I must say, Phil, what you're describing is so outside my experience, and I think many people's experience in the UK. We don't have things like conventions of biblical storytellers. We don't have scholars and biblical storytellers getting together. And I think from I know of what you do and what others who you meet with do, it's part of the fabric of many people's experience in terms of parish level, or in terms of each church level. Is that correct, that biblical storytelling is a thing that people are quite familiar with?
Yeah, in pockets, right? But the people who are into it are very into it. So I know churches where it's a traditional mainline church, so there's always an Old Testament lesson, a psalm, an epistle, and a gospel lesson, and they have somebody tell every one of those every week. There's not a lot of churches that are like that, but by heart tell it. And then there's lots of us that will often pick up the passage we're going to preach on and learn it, and it helps in the sermon preparation, as well as a more dynamic engagement with the scripture during the service. What there's not as many people, like your area of expertise that I don't have, is performing the gospel for audiences that aren't churchy people. And so I think that's the fascinating piece that I hope comes out in our conversation, of how even the space you're performing in shapes the impact and meaning that the story carries.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is really exciting to be out there in the open air, as it were. Sometimes literally, in my case, and doing it for anyone. But no, it's brilliant that what you described. And just quickly, just to ask you, if you were doing a sermon on a particular passage and you'd learned something off by heart to perform, would you have them working immediately one after another, or would you have a space between one and the other? What would be the way it would be organized?
It varies. And so if I feel like the way I'm going to perform it is going to leave people puzzled, which occasionally can happen, they're expecting one thing and there's something different, I might read it in the beginning, unpack what I think is going on, and then end it by saying, here's the story.
Yeah.
More often, I'll present it during the time when the gospel is normally read, and then move right into the sermon.
Yes.
If I'm in a some congregations are resistant to this, or they won't let go of their Bible or their paper, and they're checking to see if that's really hard to perform when somebody's doing that.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how people will be able to hear it in a different place in the worship service. So in our church, there's a tradition of children's sermons where the pastor converses with the children. If I did the exact same thing in that spot as I might do it when the gospel is read, there's just a different level of expectation of accuracy and playfulness and things like that makes it easier for a new congregation to be open to hearing the word in that opportunity.
Right, it's a fascinating tale you're telling, but we must get on with the actual passage today, which is Jesus calms the storm from Mark chapter 4. Now, Phil, I must say it's particularly wonderful to have you on the show, because viewers or listeners, what you don't know is, for the first time ever on Question Mark the podcast, we are going to have a live performance of the passage. So without further ado, Phil Ruge-Jones and Mark 4, The Storm at Sea, or Jesus Calms the Storm.
And on that day, when evening came, Jesus said to them, let's go to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they take him along, just as he was in the boat. There were other boats with him. And a savage squall of wind whips up. And the waves were bombarding about the boat, so that the boat was already filling. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. And they rouse him and say to him, "Teacher, don't you care? We're about to be destroyed." And rising, Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Silence! Shut up!" And the wind stopped. There was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you such cowards? Don't you have courageous trust yet?" And they were frightened with great fear, and were saying to each other, "So who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?"
Wow.
That's it.
That was,
You picked a short one.
a
short story compared to some others.
Oh, it's great. What a wonderful performance. Thank you so much. And apart from it being very moving, I think some of our listeners will be thinking, hold on, I don't recognize that translation. Would you be able to say a little bit about the text that we were using?
So I began with somebody else's passage. My initial start at the passage is out of a book called Marcus Story. And it's by one of my mentors who is very concerned about orality, and many of our texts, many of our translations clean up things that are oral. Probably the easiest example is in the Greek, the word kai appears 16 times. That's the word and. It's translated and. I went through some. I don't know what translations you're accustomed to, but we use in my congregation the NRSV. It only has 9 of the 16 that it preserves. The NIV only preserves 5 of the 16. The Message only has 3, and I'm like, but that one's supposed to be very oral. But yeah, only 3 of the ands. And the Living Bible has 8. Another one that's kind of supposed to be more of an oral feel to it. The Good News Bible only has 8. The King James is the exception. It really tends to preserve the ands, and it has all 16 of them, as did my translation. So I start with David Rhodes, the author, and Joanna Dewey, the author of Marcus Story's translation.
Yeah.
And then I rework it. The other thing that I changed that I don't know of any other published translations that do it is there's a thing called a historic present, where a verb is in the present tense, even though it's referring to a past tense event.
Yes.
And they tend to be just erased in the translation. You would never know they were there.
Yeah.
And in this story, let me just count them. I've got a printed text, so I can do it with more ease. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 times in this very short story that it's the present tense. And then the next verb is often past, just standard past tense. And so I tend to restore that in my translation. And then there's some things I tweak. Like some people would not choose to have Jesus say shut up. They think that's not the kind of thing Jesus would say, but I like the force of it. Plus he was just woke up from a nap, and that's probably what he's trying to say when I just woke up from a nap. So
nice.
Wow. So those are just some of the dynamics in terms of the historic present is used in Mark 160 times, I think. And that it doesn't appear in the translations at all, to me is puzzling. We're all listening to our English teachers who said, no, keep your tenses accurate. And
exactly. It's all got to be consistent, but there's a reason, isn't there, for the historic present? At least one suspects there is.
Yes. And I think there are different reasons for it, that like the color blue can play different roles in different paintings. This can allow different tone to show up. In this one, I think it establishes a sense of immediacy. You feel like you're in the midst of the storm, and chaos. And they're all before Jesus silences the storm. Then it settles into more accustomed grammatical patterns. And so you get this kind of things bouncing around component.
Yeah.
Jesus settles that down, and then things are settled down. And so the grammar reflects what's happening in the content of the story as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Listen, I've got the NIV in front of me, and that's the one I've learned. Take your point exactly, though, about the limitations of that translation. But since that's the one I've got in front of me, that's the one I may look at. But please, at any point, bring in anything that you've just got there in front of you to help us, Phil. But I think, we can talk about this passage as far as this podcast is concerned in any way we like. But as I mentioned to you before we started being on air, I guess it's quite important to work out for our listeners and for ourselves what this might have meant to its first listeners, or the first readership, because I know most people who met this text weren't readers as we know them, but nevertheless they were aware of how to, they had it in front of them, presented perhaps in a similar way to the way you've just shown us. What would they have thought? What would have been going on? Can we speculate on that, and why?
So I think that there are ways you can look at the passage to say it's driving towards a particular point. En route, it makes lots of points. And so I tend to think less in terms of meaning, but more in terms of the impact that the passage has on hearers. So, and I think in that sense, it's a many mansioned house, and there's lots of rooms you can enter into and dwell in. And that for me, the holy space is between my lips and your ears, and that God is doing what needs to be done. And so you could have 20 people hearing it, and they could hear 12 different things because of their life experiences need them to. But if I had to say what I think it's supposed to be driving, like if there's a main point it's driving towards, I think it's raising the question of who Jesus is.
Yes.
So often at the very end of an episode, you'll get the final point driven home. And I think we're supposed to be with the disciples saying, so who is this guy? And how is it that the wind and the sea are controlled by his command?
That's it. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. That last verse, who is this, seems to be the key point, doesn't it? And it's not the first time this has come up. So it's the question. It's kind of, for me, it feels like it's planted in a way for us, as well as the one that the disciples obviously wanted an answer to. So maybe we ought to start there. Who is this then? What is the answer?
So I think it's a complicated answer intentionally by Mark, because he could have said, and so Jesus said, I am the Son of God, the Christ. And he doesn't. He doesn't say that. And so I think that Mark is set up so we have to puzzle that out ourselves to a certain degree. And there are several ways he does it. He does give us Mark's own take, or the author's, the composer's own take in the very beginning of the gospel. He says, this is the good news. So we know it's good news. This guy's about good news of Jesus, the Christ, or the anointed one, or the Messiah, depending upon how you translate that, the Son of God. Okay, so he tells us that outright, and it's never stated quite that clearly throughout the whole thing. And so so we do know that much from beginning in, but the way the story is put together, I have a friend named Elizabeth Melvin, and she says, in doctrinal statements, if you're confessing a creed, you have a very clear statement, and you say one thing, and that's what you want it to say. The way narrative works is it throws you in the midst of many dynamics that are in tension with each other. And the specific way she sees that is the narrator keeps pointing to Jesus and saying, this guy is the anointed one. This one's God's messenger doing God's work, caught up in what God is doing in the world. But Jesus never says that about himself until the very end of the gospel. So the narrator points at Jesus, and Jesus keeps pointing to God. And so even at the end of the story, you could say, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And the response could be, it's Jesus, the Christ, who controls the wind and the sea, or it's Jesus who is able to tap into God's power, which can control the wind and the sea, which is not completely different, but it's a subtle different, and you're kind of caught in that tension.
That's fascinating.
What is your response to that?
Well, that's interesting. I think the tension is there, and that explains why you get a variety of possibilities raised by scholars, I think, it seems to me. One of them I'm working with at the moment, a guy called John Burnett, who does something called the Gospel of Mark workshop. And I'm having kind of lessons with him every week. It's really interesting. And I'm no doubt being quite moved and affected by some of the things that have come up in our conversations. One of the things that's quite noted about his response, I'm guessing to a passage like this, although we haven't covered it yet, is the high Christology he has, and the sense that for him, the most powerful impact of the story is, as you say, Jesus's identity, but Jesus's identity not as a human being who has God's authority, although he is, but as Yahweh himself. And this is as he would put it, I think, this is the Lord God of Israel let loose in the person of Jesus, walking as he said he would on planet Earth. So in that respect, I mean, because that's quite recent in my experience, I'm quite stirred by that. And there's something about this passage in particular for me that might reinforce that suggestion. But even if it doesn't, it certainly is something I'm sure most scholars would agree, it does. These things are significant. The fact that Jesus clearly has power over the forces of nature, that's unusual. And not only that, these forces of nature, as far as I can tell, they are synonymous with, at least the sea in biblical times was synonymous with the powers of evil and darkness and death. So there's something going on beyond the most obvious literal kind of meaning here.
Right.
There's some kind of symbolic meaning, if you like. And I wonder, I don't know for sure, because we aren't there, but whether the listeners, the hearers at the time this was performed would have been aware of that particular sense of the sea having hold all of these connotations, and Jesus having power over the sea, just like God, the creator, has power over chaos at the beginning of the Bible, and just as God divides the Red Sea in the story of Exodus, and so on. There's something really and really significant. And so to have to question at the end of the passage, who is this, and to leave it unanswered, I agree with you. I think that's brilliant what you say about the fact that we don't get an answer, actually. We have to work it out for ourselves. But for me, at this point in the story, there's at least a hint of something really dramatic going on, mind-boggling, actually, and which affects how I'm going to live and how I feel about life, if this is the case.
Yeah, I would put a little more distance between Yahweh and Jesus. And so I think what Jesus demonstrates is trust. So my translation of faith is courageous trust. And that one of the things that's going on, that he's able to sleep in the midst of the storm, is he's unperturbed by this, because he knows this is in God's hand, and he's not worried. And so I wouldn't say my Christology is lower, but it's definitely closer to the earth. Because I think but it's also very high. It's like Jesus is the powerful God in the way that he describes power throughout the Gospel of Mark, which always involves relinquishing and service.
Yeah.
And so it's not just brutal, I can do anything I want power.
Yeah.
It's often, like in this case, it preserves life when he exercises his power. It's not a parlor trick.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I get the nuances there. And it's going to be interesting to hear what our listeners say about this. This is a really interesting point, isn't it? One thing that's come to mind as you've said your last answer is that translation about courageous faith. What is it Jesus is really referring to there? He says, in my translation, it says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Which isn't the same as what you said, but I believe personally that what you said is probably more accurate in terms of a translation of the Greek. Well, what is Jesus actually asking them? And I think another question people often have, I know I've heard this when I've done a performance, is he annoyed? Is he upset with them? Is he rebuking them, or is he gently kind of scolding them and and kind of thinking, oh well, these poor mortals, they'll get there eventually?
Yeah, David Rhodes, in his translation, he doesn't use courageous trust. I think he just uses trust.
Right.
But in his commentary, he notes that when you note all the times that faith comes up, it's usually not about doctrine. It's so it's not like I believe, which went for me connotes running through a creed and saying I believe that he's the Son of God. Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
It's about who you're going to trust.
Yeah.
And I'm a Lutheran, and when Lutherans talk about trust, it seems like you're kind of sitting down and trusting, which there's a dimension of that.
Yeah.
But in Mark, it often involves movement. It's about like the woman with the flow of blood who pushes her way through the crowd and courageously trusts him, grabbing onto his coat. It's about, so the answer to who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him might be, I don't know, but you can definitely trust him.
Got you.
Right. And so it's trust that you are putting into action and being bold with. It's not timid, and it's not unrelated to doctrine, but it's not doctrinal at its heart.
So what is it then? Because this is something as I was preparing for this conversation, I wondered myself, what would Jesus have preferred them to do in the circumstances? If they hadn't been exhibiting trust in the way you're saying, what would be the best option for them? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they could have all taken a nap. I don't know if Jesus is the one who's getting right what you're supposed to do, because that's another reason I would put space between Jesus and Yahweh in this, because if the point is to have faith in Jesus, they do that. Yeah. They wake him up and say, "We need That's you. True. Don't you see what's happening?"
Yeah.
And I think Jesus is maybe saying, look, God's got us in God's hands. If I can sleep, you can at least,
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, obviously we're going to have fear in life.
Yeah.
But can you face that fear courageously? So knowing you have fear, like Jesus in the garden, I don't want to do this. Yeah. This is not going to be good, but not my will, but your will go forward.
Yeah.
That kind of is how I see the courageous trust embodied, and that I don't know what, I mean, part of it is the disciples are always very, very good about exhibiting the questions that we have for us.
Yes.
And that gives us a doorway to enter into the story and say, well, if I were there, I would not be napping with Jesus. I would be freaking out alongside the disciples. And so I think they often voice the kinds of concerns we have. And so some of the other windows into this passage is that when I'm in times where I'm wondering where God is, and I thought God promised to do something for me, and I don't see that happening, it feels like God is asleep.
Yeah.
Or it feels like Jesus is asleep. And so there's something comforting in knowing I'm not the first one to experience that. And that even though it feels like that for me, don't worry, God is still there working in the situation and can bring about calm, just maybe not on my timeline. But there's comfort and even a validation of my cries. Why are you not attending to this? So that's another window into this. There's something where it's plugging into Jonah.
Yes. I'm glad you.
Because it's almost a literal description lifted from Jonah. Jonah's in the lower part of the boat, asleep on a cushion.
Yeah.
And so, but Jesus is also doing the opposite thing that Jonah is. Jonah is trying to get away from where God wants him to go. And Jesus is, so this is the thing that I like best about this story, is Jesus is trying to get them to go to the other side.
Yeah.
That's how the story begins. So sometimes the beginning cues us on something. So they're going to Gentile territories. They're crossing the Sea of Galilee. They're going to Gentile territory. I think it's for the first time. And anytime you're trying to get a people of faith to move and engage a new people of faith, storms are inevitable. Fears are inevitable. Resistance is inevitable. And when it gets complicated, we're like, you told us to do this. We're trying to bring young families in, and now let's listen to the chaos in the sanctuary. They're running around and they're crying at inconvenient times. And God's like, yep, that's what it means to go to the other side. But these are the people that the message needs to get to. And so not just you. And so I think, to me, that's a really important part of this story, that it's about the difficulty for us of getting from the place where we are to the place God would have us be.
It's rather like Jonah in that sense, because Jonah, as you say, ran away from his mission, but of course he was called to go to Nineveh, which is the most atrocious example of a Gentile kingdom. But he was called to preach there. So yeah, so Jesus is actually doing what Jonah should have done in a way.
Right. And that often, like lots of times, there'll be that parallel setup. So like, oh, this sounds like an Old Testament, but all of a sudden they go in different directions. And it's to say, Israel went for 40 days in the wilderness and didn't do well in their temptation. Jesus does well in his 40 days in the wilderness. And so you get those contrasts.
I think your argument, your idea is most persuasive, Phil. And I suspect many of our listeners will think, yeah, that's so good. Not only because it makes sense of the passage, but also because it's a great comfort as we think about, as you say, the situations we've been in, and we've not sensed God's presence. We've found ourselves feeling abandoned. And yet we can take comfort from a passage like this, that God is actually in the boat. I've heard this preached many times. God is in the boat with us. It may be that he's sleeping, but he's there. He's with us. He never leaves us. So I think that's really brilliant. Again, however, I have to say that I think this is where this is a crazy idea. I admit before I even mention it, it might seem crazy, but I was thinking about this again earlier today, and I asked myself that question, which I mentioned earlier. What would Jesus have preferred the disciples to have done then, if what they did do was wrong in some way? In other words, they didn't show trust. And again, I have to be honest, I think I'm being influenced by my mentor, John Burnett, who says something along the lines of the trust that Jesus is referring to actually is something about believing something that Jesus has already said. And what Jesus has already said, this is his idea, it's not mine, is the basic idea is that the kingdom of God has arrived. And he's asked his listeners to believe the good news. And what does that mean? That means that God has invaded planet Earth in the person of Jesus. And Jesus is there to bring human beings, creation, back to God, to deal with humankind's enemies, evil, sin, and death. To save us in that sense, to bring justice, love, and mercy into our experience where we are lost and unable to help ourselves. That's the message of the good news. And if we take on board whatever view, I guess, we take on board of Jesus' identity, the fact that he's God's messenger, he's got God's authority, is significant, I think, for this story. Maybe, I've just wondered, maybe the trust that he's inviting the disciples to have is, don't you believe anything that I've said about the reason I'm here, the reason this has happened? And I just reflected a bit more about this, and I remember back in chapter 3, and back in chapter 3, Jesus says to his disciples, I'm going to appoint 12 of you, and I'm going to give you authority to preach and to heal and to cast out demons. And so here's my wild idea. Please knock it down if you like. I'm really happy because it's only something I've come up with just today. Is it possible Jesus was upset with his disciples, and maybe not just gently upset, but actually possibly more than upset, gently upset, that they hadn't done what he was expecting them to do, which was to have faith and trust in that situation is to rebuke the storm. And he didn't need to wake up because they could have done it. Please knock me over.
No, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting, I'd have to think about that one a little longer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that results in a very high, so if your Yahweh and Jesus are closer to each other, then that it also assumes humanity's ability to step right in there alongside of Jesus.
Yeah.
Because of that, the answer is I would be surprised if Mark's answer is, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey them? Anyone who has
Yes.
courageous trust.
Good
I don't see Mark going there, but I could be wrong. And it's so I would say there is an author named, I think her name was Rita Nakashima Brock, and she has a much lower Christology than I do, but she said the reign of God is coming, and Jesus is the white cap on the wave that draws our attention to what's coming. But it's happening all around him, right? And so he's like the swell of the wave that's really visible, but that he's riding on something that's coming from deeper. That the Yahweh theme that you're talking about.
Yeah.
That and I feel like I'm siding with Jesus, who keeps pointing to God instead of to himself, right? Even though that, and not with the narrator who's saying, no, you're more with the narrator pointing to Jesus and saying, yep, no, actually, Yahweh walking right here among us.
Yeah.
And so, and maybe it's that we both, that we in any faith community, we're going to have these different things, and we need each other.
Yeah.
That I might downplay to a certain degree who Jesus is in favor of Yahweh, and you might overinflate who Jesus is, and that somewhere between us is where the truth holds.
Yes.
And maybe know how other than in a narrative do you hold those kinds of tensions
Agreed.
Together? You can't synthesize them in some clean and simple way.
People have tried, haven't they, and fought wars over it, but it can't be done. I don't think. You're absolutely right. Wow, that's really exciting.
I wanted to go back to your point about I think people, whether they were part of Israel or not, if they lived near water, they would understand the chaos and the threat that you talked about, that water as a symbol has. And the friend I mentioned who has the Deflecting Christology book, her first book, went through and noted all the settings in Mark. Yeah. And you and I both tell it, but I was still utterly surprised that she listed them in order, and then would just occasionally start over. And running like a column through the middle of it was stories of water. Yeah. I was really surprised at how many are, and amazing. The miracles often happen either right before going into the water or right afterwards. And so there's something central about water and its chaos. And people, I think, just if you live in that time on water, you understood that there's powers of death that can operate in water. And then we could also talk about baptism, right? That there might be some kind of baptismal image here. And I don't think I can't hear Jesus saying, if you'd have done what you had to do, you wouldn't have had to endure a storm. Because I don't see Jesus. I think Jesus warns them constantly, when you're acting out of faith with courageous trust, you're going to encounter storms.
Yes, indeed.
And you're going to have times where you feel abandoned, and like the cross is the big for Jesus, right? You used the word abandoned before, that we feel abandoned, like Jesus is sleeping in the boat, but the abandoned word obviously rings with Jesus crying out on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? Yeah. And so it's taken with utter this experience of abandonment is taken with utter seriousness in this gospel, and it's not simply explained away. It's one of the major realities we have as human beings that the story addresses.
Amazing. Phil, looking at the passage again, is there anything else that comes up for you that we haven't looked at? I've got to say, so far, it's been absolutely monumental, sort of things we've come up with today in a very short time, but I'm just wondering if there's anything else here.
So there's some odd things, like why mention the other boats? Yeah. I don't understand what that's about, except that maybe then he's not just calming the storm and saving the disciples. There's others that are on the sea with him. I don't know but that to me is like a little odd thing.
Yeah.
And then I feel like you and I may have talked about this, but there's a stream that flows through the whole gospel, or a thread that runs through it, of people rising. And you don't always see it because the translators sometimes say they got up, but if you keep translating it as rising, to me, it's saying this is what death and resurrection looks like in everyday life. So yes, one day we will die and God will raise us, but all of life is death and resurrection. It's about like having fears and then getting to a place where there's peace. And in this story, Jesus, one of the things resurrection looks like is Jesus rises and faces the storm that's in his life and calms it. And so one of the things resurrection can look like in our lives is having the courage to face very difficult things coming our way and allowing God to bring us peace in the midst of things that are way beyond our control.
That is wonderful.
So I would note that little piece. I think we've covered a lot. It also ties into probably the other story that it ties in most clearly with is when Jesus walks on the water, not in the water, on the water later on in the gospel. It has a kind of an echoey feel.
Yeah, agreed. Phil, you've really helped me. I don't know what our listeners are thinking right now, but for me to hear about the importance of death and resurrection in everyday life is so heartwarming and encouraging, because you brought this passage down and you've made it relevant to our everyday experience. It's not some kind of mystical kind of neverland we're talking about. We're talking about everyday grit and troubles as much as our joys and the wonderful things that we experience in life. So thank you ever so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you. And
I have one other thing that I just think is interesting, because I'm talking to a storyteller, is that I think the story takes on new life when the narrator isn't hovering over the top of it, but is in the midst of it.
Yeah.
And so when I'm narrating the storm, I want it to feel like I'm almost seeing it for the first time. A squall of wind whips up and the waves are bombarded. Like I'm not over and above it. I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's another way of inviting of giving you as an audience permission to say, life is like this.
Yes.
You can feel this with us, and we'll get through it. So you actually feel the storm, and you get out of it. I have a friend who would tell this story. He would find a hollow place on the stage, and he would, when he's narrating the whole first part, he would alternate stamping his foot, so you'd get this. It's almost like thunder, and he could do it and still narrate it. His narration didn't have to follow, like get lockstep in with that. He could like musicians, he could play one thing while singing lyrics at a different rhythm.
Yeah.
And then when Jesus says silent, shut up, the silence is profound. And so there are some interesting things storytellers can do to even bring out the dynamics more clearly that are in it. But I don't know if they did that in the ancient church or not, but I could imagine them doing that around campfires.
Absolutely. I've often wondered what it must have been like to actually listen to a storyteller back then. And we have our ways of doing things, and they're brilliant, like you've described. Do you think back in the day there was, however, a different way of performing to the ones that we're experienced in doing these days? Maybe not so versatile, for want of a better word, or am I being unfair?
What do you mean by versatile?
I guess not so arty. I'm not saying that the example you just gave is arty, I know, but some of the things that I do are quite arty. So there's some kind of finesse or thinking about gesture and movement, which I wonder whether an ancient storyteller would have in his mind or her mind.
I think it would probably vary, even in the ancient world. That I think the original performer understood all the dynamics. I think Mark was composed orally. And so like when you go on a trip and you tell a story and you realize, that didn't quite hit home, I guess I'll drop that out next time I tell it. And this part seemed to get some energy, so I'm going to give it a little more play in it. I feel like Mark might have been constructed that way, that it was in the telling, and it wasn't just bits and pieces. It was, he had the large frame and then rearranged the furniture maybe a little bit within that.
Yeah.
But and so I think he wants the audience to make connections between different times that faith is talked about, the different water stories. He might have had a trick to get you to say, here we are again.
Yeah.
And then there, even in my world, there are some people who this is how much of their body they use, but they use it as such a tremendous instrument that it has you captivated the whole time.
Good.
And a Zoom screen all of a sudden is confining us. So different content. If you're in the market sharing the story of Jesus, it might be different than if you're in a Greek amphitheater, or like whatever the equivalent of Speaker's Corner would have been, in that time.
Yeah.
Or if you're telling your child a story before they go to bed because they're afraid and it's a Jesus story. It seems to me each of those times it would have its own aesthetic. And some would be heightened. I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Like a heightened aesthetic.
Yes.
Carefully tended. I think some of it might have just been intuitive. It wasn't like super self-reflective, but this whole rising thing, you just have people down on the ground and then you're lifting them up. And so the rising part kind of becomes manifest in the telling because of the dynamics of the story itself.
Yeah. Wow, it's fascinating. I could listen to you for ages. We're going to have to call it a day for now, though. Phil, thank you again so much for what you've done today and what you brought to us. Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it. I'll look forward to hearing what people say in the comments.
Thanks, Phil. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We'll light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.